A lot of guns were used during World War II, and that's putting it rather mildly. Many of these are very well known and understood, having penetrated the historical zeitgeist to such a degree that they've become as famous as any of the conflict's leading generals or its politicians. But for every .08 Luger or M1 Garand that has had book after book written about it and featured in countless movies and video games, there exists another 10 firearms that have received but a fraction of that attention and thus remain unknown to all but the keenest of collectors and enthusiasts. But today we're going to right that wrong. We're going to shine a light into the darkness and tell you about both the history and the design of 5 of the conflict's lesser known guns, so let's get into it. First, we have the Arita M1941, a submachine gun that was designed by one Captain Martin Orița of the Romanian Army's Military Technical Corps in 1941 and later entered service in 1943. It was designed as part of an effort by the Romanians to reduce dependence on imported specialist weaponry, particularly from Germany, and instead begin producing such weapons domestically. Orița was particularly inspired by German and Italian submachine guns, both of which had a real reputation for quality in Romania. If you put his gun beside a German MP41 and an Italian Model 38, for example, you can see the inspiration pretty darn clearly. As for how it actually worked, well, it used a simple blowback cycling system, i.e. one that uses the pressure from a fired cartridge to actuate the bolt and cycle the action. It also fired from an open bolt, meaning that the bolt was held to the rear upon cocking rather than a closed bolt as in a system in which the bolt returns forward upon cocking. So, full operation would consist of cocking it by pulling the bolt to the rear where it would be held by a sear. Pulling the trigger would then lower this sear, allowing the bolt to fly forward under spring pressure, where it would pick up a round from the magazine, push it forward and strike it with its firing pin immediately after pushing it into the chamber, discharging the round. Gases from the burnt propellant in the cartridge would then push the bolt back to the rear, where it either does it all over again if the trigger is still held, or it's caught by the sear if not. It's basically the exact same way as more famous submachine guns such as the MP40 or M3A1 grease gun operate, except that unlike those, the Orița was also select fire, as it had a mode that forcibly raised the sear following depression, thus stopping it from continuing to fire even if the trigger was still depressed. Chiefly, this addition was due to the higher rate of fire of the Orița, 600-ish rounds per minute compared to 500-ish and 450-ish in the MP40 and M3A1 respectively, which made it more difficult to hard-skill single-shot fire it by simply quickly releasing your trigger finger. It was pretty well received in its time. Romanian troops generally loved it, and even German troops who found one in their hands had no shortage of praise for its surprisingly well-built nature, intelligent design, and reliability. It wasn't perfect, however, and safety was a regular point of concern. The majority of wartime-produced models had a simple cross-bolt type safety up by the rear sight, and while this, generally speaking, did the job, it was not drop-safe, because a sufficient jolt could still loosen the bolt from the sear, where it would then fly forward under spring pressure, pick up a round, and then discharge it. But do note that this flaw was very common on most open-bolt submachine guns of the period. There are very few that wouldn't discharge if you threw them at the ground hard enough while cocked. As for the rest of the gun's design, it had an adjustable rear sight with increments for out to 500 meters, something that was actually quite a thoughtful touch, as many of its contemporaries omitted such luxuries in favor of simple fixed sights. Think the MP40, the Sten gun, or even the otherwise quite fancy M1A1 Thompson as examples. For magazines, it used a proprietary 32-round double-stack single-feed magazine. By all accounts, this magazine was pretty handy, although its single-feed nature supposedly made it a bit of a pain in the arse to load. As for the round that went into said magazine, that'd be the 9x19mm Parabellum, the exact same one used in the MP40 and the Sten gun. But because it was quite a well thought out and put together bit of kit, production was both expensive and slow, and further, it wasn't helped by Romania not exactly being an industrial powerhouse in that period. As a result, production typically hovered in the 600 to 700 units per month sort of range. Further, it is unclear exactly how many were completed come the war's end, but we do know that a little over 6,000 had been completed in October 1943, at which point mass production had been underway for a year. If you want to see one for yourself, the National Military Museum in Bucharest, perhaps unsurprisingly, has a few of them, and in fact, the chap who wrote this script actually has a picture from there, which we'll include in the video. There we go. Thank you, George. Alright, let's stick with submachine guns now and have a look at this. The Danuvia 39M/43M, which is of Hungarian origin. A fellow by the name of Pál Harali designed it in the late 1930s, and it was heavily influenced by his work on other, earlier submachine guns such as the MKMO, which he had a hand in developing whilst living in Switzerland and in the employ of SIG. It was produced by Danuvia, a Hungarian industrial giant, hence the name. Despite often being described as different guns, the 43M is actually just a variation of the original 39M, so for the purposes of this chapter today, we are going to consider them one and the same. The 43M just had a folding metal stock instead of a fixed wooden one, a shortened barrel, and an ever so forward angled barrel, all of which were intended to make it more handy for paratroopers and mechanized infantry. Don't worry too much about it. As you can probably guess from the name, the original 39M entered service in 1939, a year or so before Hungary formally threw its lot in with the Axis powers, and it followed the Hungarian army wherever it fought, by mostly the Eastern Front. As for its design, just like the Arita that we looked at in the previous chapter, it was a blowback cycling open bolt design, so we won't retread old water by going back over that. What we will discuss, however, is the cartridge it fired, because it was a major deviation from the norm, and actually quite a beastly choice. It used the 9x25mm Mauser, and to see what we mean about this cartridge being a bit of a unit, do have a look at this picture of it beside a normal 9x19mm Parabellum, as fired by the Arita, the MP40 and the Sten. But while powerful, this niche cartridge choice did prove to be a bit of a problem late in the war when Axis supply lines started collapsing, as actually getting it to the front became a tad difficult and often left 39M equipped troops empty mags. But I mean, what are you gonna do? It was late in the war and nothing was ideal for the Axis military powers at that time. Beyond that, according to most sources, both the 39M and its later 43M variation were generally well liked by the troops, with common compliments being its robustness, its reliability, and of course, the punch of its meaty cartridge. As for how many of them were made, we have exact numbers for the 39M and ballpark figures for the 43M, 13,332 and 5,000-ish respectively. Come late in the war, as things started going really badly for the Axis powers, Harali also had a crack at designing a super cutback variant that he dubbed the 44M, which was to incorporate a much simpler action and no wood at all so that it could be pumped out of bomb-damaged factories at lightning pace. It was also intended to fire 9x90mm Parabellums for reasons that were sure obvious to you, but with the Soviets pushing into Hungary that same year, Harali only managed to make a few prototypes before being forced to abandon the project. And just like the Arita, a surprising amount of these actually survived the war and found their ways to museums for your viewing pleasure. So do you want to visit one? The easiest to reach is Budapest's Museum of Military History, and yes, once again, we have a picture from our fantastic writer. Behold, and thank you again, George! Alright, let's mix things up a little now by having a look at a semi-automatic rifle, specifically this bad boy, the Italian Arragua Model 39. It was designed in 1938 by Gino and Mario Ravelli, and upon its initial conception, it had the lofty expectations thrust upon it of becoming the service rifle of the Italian army, something that would have been a big deal indeed, given their then service rifle, the Cassano, was an old 19th century bolt-action design that didn't exactly put lead down range at a rapid pace. Interestingly, this ambition was not a new one for Italy, as even before the big-chin fascist fella seized the reins of power in 1922, they had experimented with faster-firing rifles here and there, an example of which is the Sei Regati, a select-fire battle rifle from all the way back in 1890. Obviously, however, such experiments didn't really amount to much, hence the Cassano soldiering ever on. And as you have no doubt already guessed, a similar fate befell the Model 39. It entered production in 1939 and continued to be produced until 1941, but owing to the poor state of Italian industry, even at the best of times, it never entered mass manufacturing and instead was only ever produced at an absolute trickle pace during this brief window. As for the exact size of said trickle, precise production figures, they're hard to come by, but we do know that come July 1942, the army only had 100 of them in its entire infantry, and that was from an initial order of 10,000. As for how it worked, it used a short recoil action, a mechanism where the barrel and bolt are moved backward together by the force of the recoil for a short distance after firing, and then separate with the barrel stopping while the bolt or slide continues to the rear to complete the cycling process and put another round into the battery. Now that's pretty normal all things considered, and you'll find plenty of World War II vintage firearms that use this kind of action, although it tends to be pistols such as the M1911 or P38. Semi-auto rifles that use it are much rarer, with most from the period, such as the M1 Garand, Gewehr 43, and SVT 40, all using some form of gas-operated action instead, which uses the propellant gas of a discharged cartridge to actuate a mechanical device that cycles the action. What's really weird, however, is how you cock it, because its charging handle is also its front sling mount. So to charge it, rather than grabbing a handy-dandy lever poking out on the side and tugging on it, you instead must depress a locking button that normally keeps the sling mount locked in place, then yank it back using the sling, which opens the bolt. This is a really bizarre way of doing it, and it often leads to the rifle having a totally flush receiver. The rest of it, however, is pretty normal. It has a sight that is adjustable for ranges up to 500 meters and feeds from normal Casano clips that are inserted whole into the rifle and then drop out of a slot in the bottom of the magazine when emptied. Using the same clips as a Casano also meant that it used the same rounds, either 6.5 by 52mm or 7.35 by 51mm, with examples chambered for both having been made. And that's pretty much all there is to say about it, at least within the confines of this video. Sadly, George or anyone else on our team has ever come across one of these in a museum, so we've got no recommendations of where you can see one for yourself. Next, we have the MG13, a German short-recoil light machine gun made by taking the earlier Dresser model of 1918, a heavy water-cooled weapon, and to simplify it a bit, yanking out all of the water-cooled Gerbins to make an air-cooled version. This was done in 1928, and 2 years later, it was formally accepted into service with the Reichswehr, the Army of the Weimar Republic. It was part of a clandestine effort to modernize German infantry equipment, which is exactly why it is the first gun we have looked at so far which doesn't have a name that roughly matches up with either its year of development or its year of adoption. By calling it the MG13, the Germans reasoned that the victorious powers would look at their other weapons, such as the MG08 machine gun, which was adopted in 1908, and the G98 rifle, adopted all the way back in 1898, and just naturally write the MG13 off as an old pre-World War I machine gun of some kind, at least on the paperwork. But the countries in question weren't fools, and they would be well aware of what it was the second they took a look at it. It soon found itself replaced by the MG34, a veritable Rolls-Royce of a machine gun, and arguably the first ever true general-purpose machine gun in 1934, which incidentally was also in development since before the bad moustache man came to power in 1933. A happy little accident that just happened to be perfectly timed for his rearming schemes. So, in that case then, what gives? Just what is the MG13 doing on our list of lesser-known World War II guns since it was replaced before the war even broke out? Well, it turns out that the Austrian armband enthusiasts' rearmament plans needed such an insane amount of machine guns that German industry simply couldn't keep up with the demand, and so despite having long since been officially replaced, the MG13 soldiered on in service. Initially, this was with everyone, even frontline troops who used it during the invasions of both France and Poland. It was eventually kicked back to second-line units, however, as Germany's war economy got into full gear and greater numbers of the MG34 and later the MG42 became available. It was also used in the Panzer I light tank, where two of them formed its main armament, although the Panzer I and the MG13s inside of it were all gone from frontline service come 1941. As for its design, the MG13 was actually a pretty smart bit of kit, incorporating several useful features to maximize its lethality on the battlefield. For starters, there was its double crescent trigger, which enabled both fully automatic and single-shot firing from the exact same trigger without the need to mess about with any switches or levers. Just squeeze the top finger indentation and you only get a single shot, and then move your finger down an inch and press on the lower finger indentation, and the MG13 would let rip and give it the business. And if you are wondering exactly what round it sent down range, that'd be a 7.90 by 57mm Mauser, the standard German rifle and machine gun round of both world wars. Further to that, other smart but less unique features included an integrated folding bipod that made it both easier to transport and less likely to get snagged on things as it was moved around the battlefield, a carry handle on the top so that a gunner could quickly get on their feet and grab it if they needed to scarper, a barrel that could be quickly swapped in combat in order to enable sustained fire without any water cooling mechanism, and a folding stock, which was handy indeed if one was fighting up close and personal and wished to Rambo it. One thing that was less smart, however, given how the MG13 was made with sustained fire in mind, was the fact that it was magazine-fed rather than belt-fed. Given the fact that it used 25-round magazines and had a rate of fire of 600-ish rounds per minute, this would mean that if you kept your finger depressed on the lower trigger, it would empty a magazine in a mere 2.5 seconds, at which point firing would have to cease until a fresh one could be stuck in, although it did at least have a bolt hold open mechanism so that it didn't need to be recocked. Compare that to something belt-fed like the MG34 that it replaced, however, where if you were dug in and needed to lay down some heavy fire, you were able to simply attach multiple belts together and keep fire up to your heart's content, barring changing the barrel, and you can see the problem. If you want to know where you can see one of these, don't worry, despite being relatively lesser known, they aren't really that rare. Head to basically any half-decent World War II or armament museum, and they'll have one knocking about. Probably. For our final lesser-known weapon of World War II, we have this, the MP3008, a German submachine gun produced right at the tail end of World War II. If you happen to be thinking this one looks just a tad familiar, don't worry, you've got good reason for your suspicions, as it is a near direct copy of the British Sten, just with its magazine well rotated to be pointing downwards rather than out of the side. The rationale behind it was simple enough. The war was going really, really badly for Germany, and as the walls began caving in, they needed something cheap and cheerful that they could put into the hands of all the old men and children that were being conscripted into the ranks of the Volkssturm, a militia that, to all intents and purposes, is roughly equivalent to the British Home Guard, which you are more likely familiar with. And if you aren't familiar with, that means you've never seen the incredible classic British sitcom Dad's Army, have you? Strictly speaking, the MP3008 was a Mauser weapon, as they were the ones who reverse-engineered the Sten to create it in early 1945, but to describe it as a true Mauser weapon in the way we would say a K98K rifle isn't quite correct. Because while the K98K was a Mauser design that had production outsourced in a way that saw strict quality controls to ensure that every rifle pumped out matched Mauser's own in-house standards, thus making it a moot point where it was actually made, the MP3008's blueprints were instead hurled at anyone who had a lathe-going spare with vague instructions to the extent of, yeah, just, make it go bang, bang, and we'll be fine. And we really do mean anyone. Surviving records indicate that everyone from local mechanics through to enthusiast metalworkers with a tool shed were given orders to manufacture them. This led to a huge variety in their appearance, with MP3008s documented over the years featuring everything from wooden stocks to solid metal stocks to wire stocks to, well, no stocks at all. Beyond just the stock, however, they can also be found with pistol grips, normal Sten-like grips, and sometimes even no clear grip at all. Really, any and every weird way that you could think of making one of these, well, it was probably done at some point. As for how it worked, it was blowback operated, which we're now very familiar with, and it fired from an open bolt. It was chambered in 9x19mm Parabellum, the standard submachine gun round of the German military, just to keep its logistics nice and easy. And for this same reason, it was also designed to take standard 32-round MP40 box magazines. As for its rate of fire, most sources put it in the 450-ish rounds per minute sort of range. Unfortunately, we ultimately have no idea how many of these were made. Due to the rushed and haphazard nature of its production, the documentation needed to give full production figures was simply never made in the first place, never mind it surviving to this day. Most historians, however, when pushed, will usually give a figure around 10,000. Despite this, a fair few survive, and typically there is at least one in most Western countries' big armament museums. For example, there's one at the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds, England, but unfortunately, George didn't take a photo, so we can't show you that one. Thanks for watching.